pleased to welcome today Professor Michael Spence, Nobel Laureate in Economics. Professor Spence, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Alan.
Thank you. If I'm not mistaken, you shared the Nobel Prize with two other people. One of them was Joe Stiglitz back in 2001.
Yeah, seems like a long time ago. Yes, it was Joe Stiglitz and George Akerlof.
Professor Spence, you have said that the world economy is facing a huge negative shock after COVID, and that there is an uncomfortable and a very unfortunate path ahead of us due to this crisis, a rather slow and painful global recovery. In economic terms, tell me your vision of the likely path of recovery.
So it depends a little bit on where you are, Alan. So in the developed countries, Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, I think we're going to have this incredibly sharp drop. It will vary from country to country. Then we'll have a trough while we try to get the virus under control. The backdrop of this is there's relatively few examples of countries that got control of the virus early enough on to essentially stop it, right? So it got out of control more or less invisibly pretty much everywhere. After that trough, what you'll see is a relatively slow recovery, faster in some sectors than others, and you hope continued progress and sort of getting the virus out of the system. Of course, a vaccine would sort of truncate that slow process and produce a much more rapid and sharper increase.
Well, let's talk about the various parts of the world. The United States, are we talking about a 9 or 10% GDP contraction in 2020? Are we talking about a V curve or a U curve? Are we talking about a recovery that will take until 2021? Are we talking about unemployment of more than 40 million people that will reverse itself quickly? What's your U.S. vision?
The U.S. vision is a quite large drop. I think the GDP numbers and growth rates really mislead you when there's this much fluctuation in short periods of time, right? So the direct answer to your question is we're on a 1 quarter basis, we're going to take a tremendous drop, on the order of 25%. That's the unemployment rate if you count people who've been furloughed and so on. Then we have the trough that we're experiencing now, and we're starting to come out of it. And I think we can expect what I would call a kind of medium, slow recovery with lagging sectors where there's real problems, like international travel, like big sports events, things that where people's risk aversion, even if there's no restrictions, are going to cause them to be reluctant to dive right back in. So certainly no V, right? Barring a vaccine arrival. Slow recovery, it might look something like a U. What I'm expecting is drop, flat, and then a recovery that tails off as you go off into the future.
You're predicting that between this year and next year, the US economy, which is a $20 trillion economy, will have a contraction, a reduction in output equivalent to between 6 and 11 trillion, so up to half of the economy, and it will be 2022 before the US economy returns to a level of 20 trillion GDP, which is what we saw in 2019.
That's correct. That range depends, Alan, on how fast the recovery occurs.
How important are the trillions of dollars of liquidity and quantitative easing from the Federal Reserve on the one hand, and the trillions of dollars of fiscal stimulus coming from the Treasury on the other side?
Though they're incredibly important part of the policy response, because what the Fed is doing, I think, other than making sure the markets continue to work and we don't get some kind of lockup and a kind of financial crisis type event, is creating fiscal space. And most governments, including the American one, is using that fiscal space to essentially buffer the shock to the real economy. And that means buffering the shock to households, buffering the shock to businesses, and if necessary, making sure that we don't have a financial problem somewhere, say in the banking sector. So that's all, very sound policy. And one hopes that the buffering of the shock will turn into actually moving the damage to some extent to the sovereign debt side. And that's not because everybody wants, a whole lot more sovereign debt, but the question is, what's worse for the economy? A bunch of households whose balance sheets have been damaged, who don't want to consume, which would hurt the economy a lot, or more sovereign debt. And I think they've got it exactly right. The sovereign debt is the better of the two options.
Does it matter, as a practical matter, that the US ratio between public debt and the GDP, which was running at about 96% before COVID, will jump to what, 110 or 120% in a few months?
Yeah, it does matter. I mean, I think one of the consequences of this is that the central banks, the big ones, the ECB and the Fed, will have to, well, they've gone back to highly aggressive accommodative monetary policy, but they'll have to retain it for a considerable period of time. So we're going backwards in that dimension. But again, that'll have consequences. That'll cause, if you like, distortions in resource allocation. There will be more fiscal constraints than one would have ideally liked. I mean, Italy is a good example, which you know well. We started at about 130 to 35% of sovereign debt to GDP. We're going to end up at 160, maybe more. That's not an ideal position to be in from the point of view of kind of the normal functioning of the economy and the government's participation in it. But again, in crises like this, the choices, tend to range from not so great to really bad. And
Sure.
So far, I've been impressed.
You've been impressed with the way the Italian government has been handling things, or the European authorities, or both?
So Europe was looking like it was going to sort of, everybody's on their own kind of path that we went down before, but that looks like it may be reversing now, as again, very well. So I'm extremely encouraged, by the ECB's behavior, their, firm commitment to prevent, volatility in the sovereign debt markets, but even more important, the initiative that appears to have started with Macron, President Macron and Chancellor Merkel. So if they manage to pass this $750 billion fund that's designed to support countries and fund it with European debt, that is a huge step forward.
And would you agree with Mario Draghi that in the new normal, permanently higher levels of debt, whether it's for Italy or America or the average in Europe, will become part of our new life and will not be a problem in the next 5 or 10 years, because this will be what we will have to live with?
Yeah, I think that's basically right. Look, it depends entirely on Europe holding together and backing the ECB. But what Mario was saying, I think correctly, is if the ECB's commitment is as strong as it was when he made his,
Whatever it takes,
then Italy sovereign debt will have yields that are manageable, not great, but manageable. If the ECB walked away, we could flip to nominal yields on the sovereign debt, that are in the 6 to 7% range, and that's not sustainable.
And in terms of Italy, depending on the European Recovery Fund being approved, we're looking at about 180 billion euros of total grants and loans. If you take around 80 billion of what they call fondi perduti, or grants, then you take another 40 billion potentially of EIB loans. You take another 37 billion of potential MES loans at zero interest. You take another 20 billion of sure help for unemployment benefits. You put all those elements together, you get to about 10% of Italian GDP, which is about what Italy's GDP will drop by in 2020. Does that sound right to you as the right way to go?
It's the right way to go, but the data that I have in a new project to track what we call the pandemic economy, I think the hit to the Italian economy could easily be larger than that.
What would be your assessment of the GDP drop this year for Italy?
What we do know is that Italy has been in the sort of pandemic economy mode for, I would guess, well, our calculation says something on the order of 90 days.
Right.
And we've been in the trough for much longer than most of the other players in the game. And when you're in that trough, you're losing GDP and income, every single day. So I would say, just based on this kind of comparative numbers, that 10% would be on the optimistic side.
So just to understand, Professor, if Italy were to suffer a 10 to 13% contraction of its GDP this year, how many years do you think it would take, given that Italy has an average growth rate that's been low, before Italy's GDP gets back up to the level it was at in 2019?
I think a reasonable guess is 2 to 3 years. When you take away the constraints associated with the virus and people's reaction to it, I don't see any reason to think that Italy won't go back to where we were. And then we may or may not resume, modest growth, as you said, in the 0 to 1% range, or maybe we'll do something that causes that to accelerate. But that's all to be determined in the future.
So you're actually more optimistic about Italy's recovery potential over a 2 to 3 year period now than was the case after the crisis of 2008, 2009.
Yes, I am. I mean, I think this is a very hard hit, but it will go away. There are a few things that could happen that would make that prediction optimistic. If we let a lot of businesses get destroyed in this by not supporting them enough to get through it, that would produce semi-permanent damage that would make the recovery period longer and do a lot of harm as well. But they're kind of on that, and one of the reasons we're opening economies now, even though you could argue we don't have complete control of the virus, is precisely because you can't put an economy in lockdown forever without producing permanent damage. So I think that, again, the policymakers are making tough choices, but because they're trading off, debt against very tough economic outcomes. But I'm of the view they should be making those choices. But that's why we're opening up now.
Do you think Italy should take everything Europe's offering, including this 36 billion euros of zero interest loans from the exchange stability mechanism, it's called in Italian the MES, and use that for health matters?
Well, I mean, there are conditions on those things. I think they should take everything that's being offered. Yes,
including the 36 billion of low interest.
Yes, here in the north, where we had a health system that we were quite proud of, we overwhelmed it. So I would take that and have a program that's devoted to resilience and handling peak load problems, because this is probably not the last time we'll experience this.
If you were advising the Italian government, or if you were the prime minister yourself, what would be the 2 or 3 economic policies looking ahead that you think would be most important to help Italy to grow again?
The policies of the Italian government, I think, are, from the point of view of recovery, are quite sound. They've been careful about the virus, but they are about to let Italian residents and citizens travel between regions, and they're about to let tourists in. Now, I understand that because it's an economy that has a very big sector dependent on tourism. So that's probably okay, but it would be safer if it were accompanied by an elaborate system of testing and tracking that can prevent a reemergence of the virus.
Let me take it to a broader level and ask you, is the COVID crisis risking creating more protectionism or less? We've seen Trump opposing the multilateral trading system and threatening China and Europe and putting all sorts of tariffs and sanctions on those countries and continents. But do we risk a deglobalization trend or not?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, we were in a deglobalization trend before that was fueled by a number of things. One is trade tensions between the U.S. and China. The second one was just the evolution of the global economy. had produced pretty large effects on domestic economies among the developed countries. And so we saw on the political side a rising pattern of nationalism, rejection of the sort of full-blown open globalization system we've been operating under. So that trend was already underway. And I think, the reasonable way to think about the virus is that at best it will sort of reinforce and amplify that a little bit. And at worst, it'll make it a lot worse.
I know that you've been one of the co-signers of an important letter calling for any anti-COVID vaccine to be distributed free everywhere in the world. Why?
Because the developing countries, especially the lower income ones, are extremely vulnerable. And unless some of them can stop the virus at the border, and in the way that 2 or 3 Asian countries did, which seems unlikely, frankly, it's very difficult to see that they have either the medical resources or the fiscal and other resources to combat this virus, to do the things we were just talking about. So I think you're going to see very difficult economic outcomes and very difficult to imagine health outcomes as well. And the saving grace, or the thing that will save us all, but especially those countries, is a vaccine. The sooner the better. And to be effective, it has to be mass produced and then is administered to everybody. So we signed it because we thought that was the best chance of averting a catastrophic outcome in humanitarian and economic terms in the developing world.
Now, Michael Spence, the pandemic has accelerated a number of trends that were already shaping our future. First of all, the shift to a digital economy.
Yeah.
The longer we have the social distancing restrictions in force, or even habits of that sort, the greater the likelihood that these changes to a more digital economy, more smart working, more automation, more digital finance, more e-commerce, could become structural. Is that your opinion? How do you see that?
We were on a path to increasing the digital underpinnings of the economy pretty much everywhere. If you went sector by sector, it was further along in some sectors than others. Tech, e-commerce, it varied by geography. E-commerce and mobile payments is bigger in China than it is in other places. But I think a reasonable forecast, really based on what's going on, is that the pandemic, which has proved an enormously important element of resilience for economies, for businesses that have a digital footprint and so on, will just get accelerated a lot. And that acceleration will be greater in areas where it was lagging before. So I think we'll see a lot of it in education and so on. Having said that, for people who are investing, there have been just dramatic changes in growth in, say, mobile payments all over the place, contactless mobile payments. You don't want to project them into the future and assume those growth rates will persist. But so I think a lot of us think what we're going to do is we may fall back from those very high growth rates, but we're not going to fall back to where we were before. So we'll be somewhere in the middle. And I think hybrid models is a useful way to think about it.
So what you're really saying is it's a paradigm shift in which crisis leads to innovation, in this case, technological innovation, but also social innovation. If you take smart working, what percentage of the population in a country like Italy or in Europe do you think is currently in smart working and will remain in smart working even after COVID?
I don't know the numbers in Italy, but I can guess because there was a study done in the United States, a kind of quick one, but and because the economies are relatively similar. In America, the estimate was that 33% of jobs could be done remotely. And I think it's probably similar here, plus or minus. And I think what will happen afterwards is that smart working will look attractive, both for businesses and for families, frankly, just greater flexibility. And we'll see a hybrid model. They won't give up on the office. So we won't do a flip from, one to the other, but we'll have more remote working than we had before.
Finally, I want to touch on international relations and politics. Even though you're an economist, politics and economics are related. Let's start with this simple, straight question. America is suffering unprecedented violence, racism, and civil unrest right now, chaos. What do you think of what's going on in America?
Well, it's very sad. And I think it's going to force us to rethink a great many things that relate to inequality, what amounts to inequality, access to high quality services for universally across the country, respect for people, and so on. So this is such a deep crisis that I think it may just be powerful enough to cause us to sort of wake up and pay attention to this.
Are you at all concerned about the stability of U.S. democracy, or is that not a concern to you?
Well, I think I mean, I worry about it, because it is possible to, as we know from a range of countries, to undercut the institutions that are the kind of rock bottom, or the base on which the system's built. So nobody, in theory, can undercut that. But if you appoint enough judges that are on a certain side of the issue and so on, you can undercut that. So yes, I do worry about it. But on the whole, when I kind of try to think about it carefully, I think the vast majority of Americans are good people who want a country in which everybody thrives and has opportunity and is not threatened and is secure economically, physically, and in other ways. And as long as that persists, I guess I think in the end, that's the defense against the darker outcomes.
Germany is Europe's biggest economy. Angela Merkel is Europe's strongest leader. She's also, by default, in recent years, become perhaps the leading protector of human rights and democratic institutions in the Western world. Her legacy, since she's on her way out the door in the next few months or next year or so, could also include being the person who helped make the European Recovery Fund happen. How do you think history will look at Angela Merkel's legacy?
I think it'll be very positive, steadiness in the context of a huge crisis, almost 10 years ago, well, 8 years ago. And toughness, she took a terrible beating when she reacted to the immigrants the way she did, maybe got out ahead of the rest of German society to some extent, and now stepping into the breach and basically saying, if we're ever going to come together and act as if we're all in it together, and we don't do it now, we'll probably never do it. So, I mean, I admire her.
Would you agree with your friend Joe Stiglitz that her one big mistake was too much austerity after the 2010 period?
I agree there was too much austerity, right? And there's a question that historians will have to answer. Was that her view, or was that constraints, imposed by domestic politics? I mean, it's a democracy. You can't get out ahead, too far ahead of the voting public, so to speak. And I don't know the answer to that. But the austerity was excessive, and recovery could have been faster, especially in the South, if it had been less severe. That I agree with.
Michael Spence, thank you for your careful analysis and your wisdom on so many issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan, for having me. It was really great fun.